I'm joined now by Michael Clyne, an analyst focusing on issues in Africa. And I want to get your reaction to this report by Amnesty International, because it is getting a bit of press, isn't it?
Yeah, it's thankfully drawing attention back to Darfur and Sudan, something that was one of the first rallying cries of the internet age, really drew public attention to the Save Darfur campaign, led the International Criminal Court to its first indictment of a sitting head of state and one of the world's largest peacekeeping missions. But flash forward about 13 years, public attention has been diverted. In some ways, the ICC, International Criminal Court, hasn't been able to bring Bashir in, and even the peacekeeping mission is being drawn down to pick up other conflicts in the world.
What about monitoring this region? Is it difficult to do so? I mean, talk to us a little bit about it.
This is a very remote region in central Darfur, and the Amnesty report was done remotely because they do not have access themselves to it for a few reasons. Number one, it's very insecure. There are aerial bombardments. It's very remote, no infrastructure, and the government restricts access to a very few amount of people. So they're going to need to get both investigators in there to ascertain whether these allegations are really true with the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, as well as reintroduce UN peacekeepers if there's going to be progress.
You mentioned attention span. It seems like our attention span shifts. Of course, the Syria crisis has really dominated the news, the migrant crisis, and this has kind of been left out. Is there enough being done on the international stage, and what more can be done when it comes to Darfur?
Well, that's right. I hate to think that public consciousness is a zero-sum game, but I think there is some reckoning there between ongoing conflicts in Sudan and other places in Africa, Syria, Yemen, other parts of the world that have seen a proliferation over the past decade. Just like the Save Darfur campaign 13 years ago was rooted in public awareness, I think it's going to take that again to mobilize the international community, drive some AU member or African nations to pursue Bashir, which saw public opinion turning in that direction somewhat in South Africa after they let him get away, and also to push the UN Security Council conversation, which actually just took place today, where Sudan is trying to boast that the Darfur conflict is under control with some iterant ceasefires that really don't mean much on the ground, and that therefore they deserve to draw down peacekeeping troops and take over security themselves.
You brought it up, Bashir, a sitting president, 2 arrest warrants out for him, and yet nothing's happened. What are your thoughts on that, and why?
It shows the rather impotence of the International Criminal Court in a region where, for maybe some obvious reasons, a lot of states have not signed on to the Rome Convention that implements its indictments. There is some optimism that even though he got away in South Africa, a South African group successfully sued the government to decry that ex post facto as an illegal, that they did not arrest him. But it's going to take more buy-in from African states if he's ever going to be brought to justice in Europe.
Yeah, I heard the word optimism thrown out there. Are you optimistic about the future for Darfur, or what are your thoughts? I mean, we've seen this language for so long. What needs to happen?
I think if we remember that just because we turn away from something, just because there's not video on the television or the news, that something doesn't stop happening.
And that's what's needed. Well, Michael, thanks so much for coming in and talking to us. Certainly appreciate it.
Thanks for bringing attention to this issue.
2016, but was this a good year for democracy, especially considering we had the ongoing situation in the DRC and Gambia, where the strongmen Joseph Kabila and Yahya Jammeh are still clinging on to power there?
That's right. Well, in a continent with 55 countries, there's always something to talk about when it comes to elections, particularly at year's end. And it's a continent with a really diverse and deeply engaged electorate, which remains, when given the opportunity, the most powerful driver for change in the world. The problem is that they're often at odds with more autocratic rulers who are looking to stay in power and exasperate political tensions and propagate really the misnomer that elections are about instability and that every election in Africa is a winner-take-all, do-or-die battle, when really they should be about the competition and exchange of free ideas. Despite all this diversity, things usually fall along two trajectories. One, you can usually guess the outcome by saying the incumbent party or leader won because they've stifled competition and consolidated power. But on the other hand, you have some countries where incumbents have lost or stepped down from their elections, and aging leaders are stepping down with more marginal frequency. The Gambia is an interesting example at the end of the year because it really represents the intersection of these two trajectories. You had an increasingly ruthless, autocratic strongman ruler who initially stepped down after making the rarity of rarities in Africa, and that's the concessionary phone call to his opponent, until, of course, he took it back and said that he wouldn't be stepping down. So as we wrap up 2016 and look forward, Gambia really hangs in the balance of these two trajectories, and as we set the stage for what 2017 is going to look like, it's unclear what path it will choose, whether it will go down like more freer regional countries like Senegal and Ghana, or whether it will fall down the chasm of political conflict like Cote d'Ivoire did about 6 years ago.
Let's talk about Ghana, Michael, since you mentioned it. It's long been an example of democracy and economic stability in Africa with the gold, cocoa, and oil, but recently falling on hard times and has sought an IMF bailout. What's happened here?
Right, Ghana represents the other side in terms of a more stable middle-income country, but also the other side of that trajectory in that an incumbent president who has conceded to his challenger. It's a more positive note to end politically on, despite its economic uncertainty and slump. But it's not the only positive outcome of 2016. There were elections at the very beginning of the year in Central African Republic, which ushered in a more peaceful government and tampered down sectarian violence there. And some of the underreported elections were not presidential at all, in fact, but were constitutional referendums in Senegal, democratizing that political system, or local elections in South Africa.
Yeah, let's talk about South Africa. Jacob Zuma survives this impeachment. He says he's done nothing wrong. What's the best hope there for the economy and this chaotic government?
Right, South Africa still sees itself as the leader of the region, and despite economic slump and political chaos, if you will, its civil society and institutions have still been able to stand up to an increasingly autocratic or chaotic government. And that really, we saw that in August when local elections saw the ANC, African National Congress, lose most of the major cities in South Africa to a series of opposition coalitions, which are now positioning themselves to show up the ANC in general elections down the line, which could see Africa's most iconic liberation movement be voted out of power.
But people there are clearly still unhappy with him, Michael.
Yes, and that's why we're looking closely to 2019 when they'll be holding their next general election, and why that despite its political and economic uncertainty, South Africa still has some of the strongest civil society that's able to stand up to increasingly autocratic or incompetent governments, and why this political trend for 2016 is really, in my opinion, a net positive, putting it on that trajectory towards a more free society despite economic and market uncertainty.
People had really great hope for Muhammadu Buhari in Nigeria, really cracking down on corruption there, but people are still really in poverty, and things are not good. What is it going to take to move it around?
Nigeria's had to weather a number of crises. First, be it economically, it's really on the losing end of the commodity slump in the past several years, particularly in oil, which accounts for the lion's share of the Nigerian economy and currency reserves. Moreover, it's battling several violent crises, most famously in the north, where Boko Haram is on a sturdy back foot. In the central region, there's actually increasing sectarian violence. And in the southern oil-producing region, there's a new militancy that's resurfaced in the form of the Niger Delta Avengers, which have slashed oil production and really cut the Nigerian government's hopes of paying off or paying for solutions to its economic, military, and violent crises. And that leaves it with little hope maybe except to negotiate a solution, a development-based longer-term solution with the likes of the Niger Delta Avengers, which may actually be the best hope for moving forward.
Well, Michael Clyne from Drum-Cusack, thank you so much
Michael,
for your time.
you mentioned Somalia, and these are the words that were used to describe it for decades: famine, civil war, Black Hawk Down, failed state, al-Shabaab. So what does this mean for this country that has been defined by so many negative words for decades to pull off a summit like this?
Yeah, I think images of war-torn Somalia are slightly outdated. If you were to see daily life in Mogadishu, the capital today, you would see bustling markets and bounding construction, funded in part by returning diaspora, partially by foreign countries. We'll have to speak about both threats and promises, but I think on balance, the IGAD summit today, followed by elections later this month and in October, should sound an optimistic note for Somalia and its people.
Well, kind of riffing off of that, the Foreign Affairs Minister noted this quote, this is the first time Somalia hosts such a high-level summit in 30 years. We see it as a historic signal and message to the world that Somalia is coming back. Is it really coming back, or is it still fragile?
Well, it's certainly a pivotal and historic moment for Somalia, but not to dispense with the optimism too quickly, but it faces a number of serious threats, particularly outside the capital, and chief among them is security. That's the reason, for instance, that today's summit was only held in the green zone near Mogadishu's airport, and there were still reports of gunfire in other parts of the capital. The chief threat comes from al-Shabaab, which technically retreated from Mogadishu back in 2011, but simply shifted from conventional warfare tactics to guerrilla warfare targeting the African Union, which went from being peacekeepers in Somalia to targets themselves, to symbols of daily life.
Well, how does the country turn the corner?
Well, there's a number of challenges that Somalia faces. I'd say there are three chief among them. Firstly, security. We talked about they're going to have to bring security not just to the capital, but nationwide to defeat al-Shabaab and strengthen a Somali national military to eventually take over that responsibility from the African Union. Second is politically. These elections are not the finish line. They're just a hurdle in Somalia's political development. They have to see if they can bring former warlords and tribal leaders into the political process. There has to be respect for a civilian government. For instance, will President Hassan step down if he loses the election? Those will have to go peacefully. Now, they're not being held nationwide. There's only about 14,000 designated voters because that would be too dangerous otherwise. And lastly, economic. Rebuilding Somalia is going to take a lot of investment and patience. Some of that will come from returning diaspora. Others will come from foreign countries looking to cash in on that peace dividend now that security improves in the heart of the country. Turkey has become a very important economic partner looking to cash in on that dividend in ways that China is looking for its returns in formerly war-torn countries such as DRC and Sudan proper.
Michael Clyne with analysis for us. Thanks so much.
You're welcome, Mike.
For more on the rather complicated situation in South Sudan, we're joined by Michael Clyne. He's an international security expert who focuses on Africa. Michael, before I get to the arms embargo, I want to talk about these brutal attacks we've seen against UN diplomats, peacekeepers, international aid workers. What is going on in South Sudan? Why so much hostility against outsiders?
South Sudan, a country that's known almost nothing but war for its existence, both since and before independence, has to be one of the most difficult and challenging places in the world for peacekeepers to operate. People there know, like I said, little, but being in a state of conflict, there's no infrastructure. And lately, peacekeepers and foreigners have become a target themselves. This has been happening increasingly since over the summer, when the last iterant ceasefire fell apart, particularly the capital, Juba, fell into disarray. Since then, they've become targets themselves, as well as the foreign aid community, and that spells a very troubling situation for a country in such disarray as South Sudan.
And how much does that disarray, the strife that we're seeing in South Sudan, how much is that translating into this these attacks that we're seeing against foreigners?
Yeah, we've seen everything from foreigners and peacekeepers being targets of violence themselves to being denied medical care. And it is, I believe, an elite strategy coming from the top of the South Sudanese political structure, which has commandeered this perpetual conflict into an elite struggle between two factions, that of the President Salva Kiir and his nemesis, a man by the name of Riek Machar. While Riek Machar is out of the country and Kiir is trying to consolidate power, he has found some utility in scapegoating and stymieing further peacekeeping or UN efforts.
And what about thousands of displaced civilians? What is life like for them?
It's millions, really, because it's been going on for decades, not just since 2013. They are living both within South Sudan in dire conditions and in refugee camps in Uganda that are saturated to levels that we're used to really only seeing in the Middle East. You have an economy that is in complete collapse. 90% of the government revenue comes from oil. Well, with the drop in oil price earlier this year and the force majeure of oil companies in South Sudan, that's been completely depleted the country of foreign reserves with inflation skyrocketing to over 700%. Currency is virtually worthless, commodities, even food, unaffordable, and the South Sudanese population really sees themselves again as a pawn among this conflict of the elites of their young country.
Young country indeed, but so many problems. Michael Clyne, thank you so much for being here.
Pleasure.
By Michael Clyne, he's an analyst focusing on issues in Africa. Gambia's decision considered a big blow to the court in the sense that the chief prosecutor actually comes from Gambia. Talk to us about the significance of this move.
Right, Mike. Gambia is actually the third of the latest countries to withdraw or signal they're withdrawing from the International Criminal Court in Africa, a continent that has the most conflicts in the world and arguably the least capable and impartial judicial space. That's an intersection that the court was intended to address in the first place. The larger or longer term problem is this in fact signals an exodus in this troubled region, because the court can only operate within its member states. So it shrinks not only its stature, but also its jurisdiction.
So are we going to see an exodus? Because Kenya and Namibia also talking about taking similar steps.
As well as Uganda. And Kenya, Uganda, and Burundi and Gambia are countries that have their own legal shortcomings and allegations of high-level political crimes that the court was supposed to address. The real problem is South Africa, which has more developed democratic institutions signaling they're going to withdraw, possibly providing cover for African neighbors as they make a play to be a leader in the region. The Gambian government statement said that the court unfairly targeted African leaders. The court is supposed to target leaders. We would think it were unfair if it were only targeting low-level officials. It's not supposed to primarily target Africans, and that's a problem that has been rumbling on the continent and that the court had foreseen for some time.
Michael Clyne is a senior analyst for Drum Cusack, the firm specializing in risk assessment. How much is fact and how much is fiction?
Suicide bombings have increased in the past month because Boko Haram is shifting to more traditional terrorist tactics as they've been routed out of the territory that they held by the counterinsurgency. As they do that, they shift towards suicide bombings and ambushes. It's true that a lot of these suicide bombings are reported to be young girls. That's been a really troubling legacy of the Chibok kidnapping.
Is this a case where Boko Haram is that strong, or Nigeria is just that weak?
I think the key word here is strategy. Boko Haram has a strategy. It's been portrayed as a ragtag group of gunmen, but they are very adaptable. The question is, does the government have a strategy? The colossus of the Nigerian government, not adaptable. They haven't been able to adapt their conventional warfare approach to the asymmetric and terroristic suicide bombings and attacks that Boko Haram can use as it shifts into space.
It is a sign that maybe they have not been as decimated as people thought.
There are three, at least, real reasons why we see the sudden escalation. One is that there's a new president in town, and they want to hit him hard before he can stand up. Two, they've adapted their strategy to the conventional counterinsurgency techniques of the government to retreat from holding territory towards more asymmetric warfare that relies on sleeper terror cells, more in the model of al-Qaeda. The third reason is that we're in the middle of the holy month of Ramadan, and that is actually an ISIL prerogative.
Okay, so what are the implications of his win on Nigeria's two militant movements, Boko Haram in the north and the Niger Delta militancy in the south?
Right. So Nigeria basically has two historic militant movements. One everyone knows about right now is Boko Haram, which is raging in the northeast of the country, the region where Buhari himself is from. And there's also a latent Niger Delta militancy, which people might remember more from the early 2000s. A lot of the disbanded militant groups in the south have threatened to take to the streets or produce more unrest or violence in protest of Buhari's candidacy. But I think ultimately we believe that the leaders of those militant groups will be waiting to see what concessions they can get from a new Buhari administration before making more attacks. After all, the president that originally brought the Niger Delta militancy under control was the former President Yar'Adua, who was a Muslim from the same northern region as Buhari.
Defeat and an incumbent. So what does that say about Nigeria's population, its voters, and how their views may have changed dramatically? And how has he been able to shed his past as a military ruler?
It's a major sign of Nigeria's maturity as a democracy, how far it's come just from 1997 when multi-party elections began. Like I said, I think the greatest impact that Buhari has had so far was his election. His election did more to instill confidence and unite the country than probably anything in the past 18 years. Nigeria is an extraordinarily young country. 70% of its population is under the age of 30. So starting or getting off on the right foot now in 2015 could mean a lot for its own political development. The influence is going to stay the same. In fact, it's spreading just from the economic model that I was just alluding to political, where China's getting involved in building political capacity with African nations, to security and being involved in peacekeeping operations. But it is, and in those instances, actually, you see somewhat that it's a two-way influence, although it's heavily weighted on one end. You see China, delving into certain doctrines that it would never explore internally or in the Asian sphere. As we see certain African countries who have grown commodity dependent on their relationship with China really crash economically. But there's still a lot of room to be made in terms of major infrastructure development projects like this information superhighway. And that still has some very positive influence potential with driving wages and capacity and kind of higher value investment up in Africa itself.
Michael Clyne joining us from New York City. Thank you.